I'm Tony Venables. I don't have to check my name, just seeing what affiliation it gives. University of Manchester, and Research Director of the Productivity Institute, which obviously has a particular interest in productivity and a considerable interest in capital stocks of various types, and also, of course, intangibles. And indeed, we do have a project underway on intangibles, and I would invite people to visit productivity.ac.uk. I'm not going to give a full description of the Institute, that would be too much, but if you want to know more about the Productivity Institute and what we're doing, please look at that website. Anyway, that's abused my position as chair. We have 3 presentations, all of them virtual, and then discussants who are in the room, and time for Q&A and according to the usual format of this conference. So the first presentation is Management Skills and Productivity, being presented by Leo Samek from the OECD. And is that set up and ready to go? What happens next? There, great. Over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me all. I'm slightly jealous that I can't be there in person, but well, that's just how it is. I can't see the slides though. Ah, okay, perfect, great. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, so this is actually now relatively old work. I think we started this project 1.5 years ago or so, but I'm still delighted to present the work today here. It was actually carried out together with my former colleagues now, Maria Grazia Spicciarini and Emil Kammerat. They since then have left the OECD. But basically, I think, that this work is very relevant because we know that, skills of managers and skills of the workforce really go hand in hand with labor productivity. But in this work here, we want to look beyond managers and we want to examine the role of organizational capital. And I think, we can all agree that defining and measuring it is not really a trivial task, especially because the tasks that traditionally have been carried out by managers have been progressively evolved, and they are now also evident in non-managerial occupation profiles. And so organizational capabilities are really embodied in firms' employees, which obviously include managers, but they are not limited to them. And so we argue that more needs to be known about the extent to which industries invest in organizational capital, and then consequently how workforce skills and the skills of organizational capital related workers really relate to productivity. And so we ask ourselves, whether there are differences between organizational capital related workers and the rest of the workforce, but then also whether skill dispersion may play a role here. And so for this work here, we focus particularly on numeracy and task-based ICT and STEM skills. And we think with the growing importance of digital technologies in basically all sectors, cognitive abilities will need to be complemented by ICT and STEM skills in the workplace. And so before I talk you through the kind of research approach, I would just give you a kind of key takeaways of today's presentation. First of all, cognitive skills correlate positively with productivity, which I think is no surprise to anyone here. Then we see that we see a positive correlation between STEM skills and productivity, which is actually larger for organizational capital related workers. And we think that really calls for the need to kind of raise the bar, so to endow all workers, including organizational capital workers, with sound cognitive skills. And then we can see that skill dispersion actually hurts industry performance. So in fact, we see that ICT skills dispersion triggers something that we call a lost in translation type of mechanism, where if ICT skills between the two groups really differ too much, then maybe communication and cooperation becomes a problem, and this then leads to a decline in economic productivity. And our work actually builds on a number of previous studies from my colleagues at the OECD. First of all, we use cognitive and task-based skill indicators that are constructed based on data from the PIAC survey of adult skills. I'm not sure whether everyone in the audience is familiar with it, but it's basically a program of the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which measures adult proficiency in kind of key information processing skills. So this would be literacy, numeracy, problem solving. But then it also collects a lot of information on how adults kind of use their skills at home, at work, and also in the wider community. And then we rely on work from Lemuel and Squiccerini, where they constructed estimates of investments in organizational capital. But I'll talk about this in more detail on the next slide. And then finally, without going into too much detail, we use labor productivity measures from the OECD STEM database. But one thing I want to highlight is that unfortunately, this analysis has to be done at the industry country level. And that's simply because of the way how we collect all of these different estimates and how our colleagues have constructed some of those in the past. So now let me start talking you through the actual approach that we've used here. So as I just mentioned, we followed a lot of different methods from our colleagues. One of those was done by Gunke et al., where they constructed ICT and STEM skill indicators based on PIAC items, and you can see them here in this table. So in this work, they used an advanced declaratory factor analysis. And again, so I'm not going into too much detail here, but in very simple terms, that just means that each factor is unobserved, but it's a weighted combination of some observed variables or items. So in our example, the skill indicator is constructed based on a number of PIAC questions, which are all around the frequency with which certain tasks have been carried out. So for instance, if you look at the STEM skill here, then it encompasses the use of charts or simple or complex algebra. And so we create this indicator based on those questions. But instead of constructing these indicators across the whole working population, which was done by our colleague Robert Kunke, we simply use their approach and then add another layer to distinguish between organizational capital and non-organizational capital. So in the end, we would then basically obtain organizational capital specific ICT and STEM skills scores at the country and industry level. So obviously now the next question would be, how do we actually distinguish these two groups? So what are organizational capital related workers? And so we rely here on the definition that was used in Lemuel and Squiccerini's work, who defined organizational capital staff as the part of the firm's workforce whose knowledge and task really affect the long-term functioning of the firm. And so these kind of tasks are all about developing objectives, organizing, and managing human resources. And so based on these tasks, they've identified a number of organizational capital related occupations, again, using PIAC. And you can find those here in this table. And basically, as you can imagine, based on these tasks, all of the managers are captured. But you can also see that actually doctors and teachers are also in there. So we try to really get a broader definition of those occupations. However, we have one issue with this. Unfortunately, the number of individuals in these organizational capital relevant occupations that we can identify in PIAC is relatively small. And so we ended up employing a broader definition where we also include occupations that have been identified in ONET. And so basically then at the end, we are dealing with occupations, as you can see here in this table from both groups. And so we get basically a more exhaustive list of occupations. And so, oh, sorry, I think this was too fast, thanks. And so now let me show you some of the results that we have. So in these figures here, you can see the median score of ICT and STEM skills, and it highlights the cross-country and cross-industry differences that really emerge in the skill endowment of the workforce. And so here we've subdivided the workers into two groups, with workers in organizational capital relevant occupations, so managers and doctors and so on in blue, and then workers in non-organizational capital occupations shown in orange. And then the height of each of these bars represents the cross-country dispersion of the median scores. And the main takeaway here is that, both graphs show that the endowment is very dispersed across the countries. We have dispersion also across industries and by occupation group. But what you can also see is that regardless of the skill type of or industry that we look at here, workers in organizational capital relevant occupations are always relatively better endowed with ICT and also with STEM skills on average, of course. And so now let me show you the model, how we try to explore the relationship between human capital that we proxy here by skills, organizational capital, and labor productivity. So on the right-hand side here, we include average ICT and STEM skill scores, as I mentioned earlier, how we've defined them. But we do this for the non-organizational capital group. So I highlighted this here in orange. So this would be the part of the workforce that is actually not contributing to the generation and accumulation of organizational capital. And then we also control for the ratio between the average skill scores of these two groups, which are highlighted here in blue. And then finally, we have cognitive skills and their dispersions. And so we use here the average numeracy skills score and the ratio between the top and the bottom 10 percentile of that score. And we control for, a number of other things like physical capital intensity, skill intensity. We experimented with the R&D expenditure, the proportion of organizational capital related staff and different things. We included country fixed effects, industry cluster fixed effects. So we tried a number of different things here. And so what you can see here is the estimation results of the different skill variables on labor productivity, where here we measured labor productivity as the log of value added per employee using OLS. And at the industry level, cognitive skill endowment of the overall working population correlates positively with productivity. And that's especially the case for numeracy, but also for STEM skills. And since the skill indicator here are all measured on a scale from 0 to 100, a 1-point increase in the numeracy skill score relates basically to a 1.8% increase in productivity. And that's quite substantial. And then for the STEM skills, we can see that a 1-point increase of the score of non-OC related workers relates to 1.4 increase in productivity. And then we have a positive and significant coefficient of the STEM ratio. And that basically indicates that a positive relationship exists between STEM and productivity, but that it's even larger for the organizational capital related occupations. And what we thought was particularly interesting here in this table was that we see the opposite is the case for the ICT ratio variable. And that basically suggests that a larger gap between the ICT skill endowment of organizational capital and then non-organizational capital related staff is really associated with a decrease in productivity. So in other words, the skill dispersion really seems to hurt industry performance, maybe because it impinges on the information flow, leading to kind of relevant information being overlooked. And so this is what we refer to as like the lost in translation mechanism. However, of course, this model suffers from selection bias and heterogeneity. So there are a lot of issues with that. And even though we're not claiming any causality here, we basically explored a number of different avenues to see how we can possibly address it. And so one issue is that, workers with higher skills may self-select into larger firms because, for instance, there might be better career prospects. And so this then, they generally tend to be more productive and so, pay comparatively higher wages. So we have this one issue here. But then at the same time, more productive firms tend to be larger and may give workers more opportunities to improve their skills. And so in this case, our model would suffer from reverse causality. Finally, of course, we may have an issue with omitted variable bias if some unobserved factors affecting both skills and productivity, like socioeconomic background, are omitted. And so we try to control for this by combining a Heckman selection model with an instrumental variable approach in kind of like a three-step procedure. And I'm just very, very quickly going through this because, as I was saying, so we're not, claiming any causality here. We're just using it to kind of double check our results. So first, we follow the literature and we instrument numeracy skills with parental education. But we do so, quite cautiously, given that school attainment may mirror some non-cognitive components of human capital that shapes earnings, but are not captured by our numeracy score. Equally, obviously, family ties may help to obtain better jobs. Then we instrument the ICT skill variables with email use at home. So in PIAC, there's also a question about that. And we argue that, this is expected to affect productivity primarily through the ability to perform ICT task-based skills, but not directly. So in other words, a worker can perform certain ICT tasks at work only if the firm also has the infrastructure and the organizational arrangements for the worker to do so. So being just able to perform an ICT task at home is not enough for the worker then to shape the kind of productivity of the firm where he or she works. And then in the Heckman selection model, we examine the probability of self-selecting into a larger or small firm type of employer. And so we used actually two different exclusion restrictions here. We played around with them a little bit. And so we tried to capture some network or social mobility effects. And then so that we call the same path variable, and then ICT use at home. So this would be online banking, purchasing things online, these kind of things. And so we argue that social mobility may influence the choice of their children's employment, because we are relying here on parental education as well, but it may not impact on labor productivity directly. And similarly, workers using ICT at home may help shape the ICT skills, but it shouldn't affect the productivity at work. And so the results here are shown in the second column. And you can see that the coefficient for STEM for non-organizational capital workers remains statistically significant. We are losing some stars for the other variable, as you can see. But we think, this is maybe just demanding too much from the model, given that we have 3 IVs in there, different exclusion restrictions. So for instance, if we use only 2 of the 3 IVs, then, the story remains the same. Unfortunately, because we are dealing working at the industry country level here, we are dealing with a small number of observations. So as I was saying, this is just something to double check our initial findings. But then we also used gross output rather than value added as like a double check, and the findings seem to remain robust. So taken all together, we basically say, we're not claiming causality, but we would argue that these results can be interpreted as kind of additional evidence confirming the initial results that we have. And so now let me conclude basically. So investments in cognitive skills are important because cognitive skills endowment of the overall working population correlates positively with labor productivity. And this is particularly the case for numeracy and for STEM-related skills. For organizational capital-related workers, so these are the managers and the doctors and so on, the focus should be on really upgrading STEM skills, because the positive correlation between STEM skills and productivity is generally larger for those. We also find evidence about skills dispersion hurting industry performance, especially when it comes to skills related to the acquisition, processing, and sharing of relevant information. And then we can see that ICT skills dispersion seems to trigger a lost in translation type of mechanism, where the gaps in ICT task-based skills of organizational capital related workers and then non-organizational capital workers reflect or create some difficulties in communication, information flows, and maybe cooperation between those two groups. And this is likely to lead to relevant information kind of being overlooked or underutilized. And so this would then impinge upon the economic productivity of sectors. So I will finish here. We added a hyperlink to the paper here, which, Mercy, I don't know whether you can share this. Otherwise, I'm happy to send an email to everyone. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Leah. Terrific job galloping through that. The discussant is Larissa Marioni from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research.
The slides, please. Mercy. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so thank you very much for the thank you very much for the presentation, Leah. And as I was introduced, my name is Larissa, and I work for the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to read the paper. It was a very interesting paper. It's not my main expertise, but I really enjoy reading it. I will start by giving a brief summary of the paper. So the paper investigates the relationship between the workforce skills levels and productivity, and whether this difference emerge in the way that skills of OC workers and the other workers, non-OC workers, relate to the industry performance. Why is that important? Because the focus of the literature lies on the link between the firm's level OC and productivity, or between the workforce level skills and productivity. But the link between this, among these three elements, the interaction between OC skills and productivity is largely unexplored. So that's how the paper fits the literature. In the second part, the paper also tries to explore the causality by combining a Heckman selection model with instrumental variables approach. And here I have a bit of, so I have some concerns about the second part, but the first part, the paper succeeds very well in claiming, in making this first, shedding some light on these three elements together in productivity. But on the second part, as I pointed there, it tries to claim some causality, and also as Leah presented, she said it's not proper causality because it's very difficult to believe that those instruments are exogenous. So I'll give a brief, some comments about it. So to start with, I think the paper, it's a very dense paper. There are a lot of regressions, a lot of results. So I would suggest to start by summarizing these results, maybe presenting the coefficients in a kind of a graph comparing the 3 steps and the OLS model, because if I'm not mistaken, the 3 steps model, lots of the coefficients, they are non-significant. So even though it's a very interesting approach, what is it adding it to the model or to the discussion? My second point is the author said, quote, using email at home is expected to affect productivity primarily through the ability to perform ICT task-based skills, but not directly. So what about people working from home or people using, primarily workers at home using email for working purpose? So that's why I think it's a bit difficult to claim exogeneity of the instruments. The other point is, are these results surprising? Because some of them, they are not surprising at all, but I think it would be interesting that the author should state ex-ante expectations about these results. For example, the numeracy turns insignificant when it's instrumented with parental education. What is the possible explanation for that? And also this is contrary to the literature, because the literature finds positive and larger effect of numeracy when instrumented by parental education, particularly for wages. My other point is, well, also related to that, discuss the potential mechanisms through which the skills of the OC or non-OC workers affect productivity. I think that's just to beef up a little bit more in the results discussion, instead of just like presenting the coefficients, but giving a bit more explanation on that. And the other point is more a question I have. So the selection model includes only 3 industry clusters, and manufacturing, other businesses, and public sector services, even though the authors, they cluster by seven industries. So why those sectors? Why clustering by these 3 sectors rather than 3 other different sectors, or I don't know, 4 sectors? And the policy implications, here Leah presented a bit on the she's told on the presentation some of the policy implications, but I think that's a bit, it's missing a bit in the paper as well. So discuss a little bit more the implication of those results. So what is the importance of those results? Should we focus more on training for working people or early years training? What would be the best approach to that, given the results? Well, thank you very much again. That's it.
We've got some 9 minutes, so I think let me open it up for questions right away, then ask Leah to sort of come back and react to the discussants' comments and questions. Yeah.
I say hello to Leah. It's nice to see you, Leah,
Sure.
even though just on the screen. This is Michela Vecchi from Middlesex University. It's interesting what you've done, but I think you're missing an important variable. I don't know if you can have a measure for this variable, which is non-cognitive skills. You've probably heard about this literature. Non-cognitive skills are also related to cognitive skills. So there might be a big problem of a missing variable in what you are estimating. I don't know whether in the data set you have any information on non-cognitive skills, which would allow you to address this issue.
Yeah, if you can hold the questions in your head, Leah. Monique?
Able to also think about ICT capital or ICT capital dispersion as a potential emitted variable.
Did you catch the beginning of that question? It was
No, would you mind repeating
Yeah,
it?
with-
Sure, I'll
without
go again.
microphone.
Sorry, Leah. Nice to see
No
you.
problem.
No, I was just wondering if you had been able to consider ICT capital available to low OC workers or the dispersion of that capital as a potential candidate for emitted variable.
great. Leah, do you want to respond to those questions and anything the discussant said? And then maybe there'll be a few more.
Yes, sure. I'll start at the back. First of all, it's really nice to hear familiar voices, even though I can't see you, so that's great. Yeah, so with regards to ICT capital, so we looked into that. The problem was there that we couldn't then really get the matching correctly done at the right level, and the information was also missing for a number of countries. The problem is with this kind of analysis that because it's work that it was carried out at the OECD, it always needs to have this cross-country comparison. And so once we miss, unfortunately, many countries, there's no point in really doing the analysis anymore. So we looked into that, but yeah, there was no way we could use this. So we tried to then look into some other components that we tried to incorporate. But for instance, I mean, just to give you an example, it was the same issue with R&D expenditure. So we wanted to include that, but we already lost a number of observations in a couple of previous steps, and with the integration of more variables, we would have had an even bigger problem with that. Then, yeah, with regards to the non-cognitive skills, I couldn't agree more. So PIAC is great when it comes to task-based skills, and then with cognitive skills. With non-cognitive skills, so more socio-emotional related skills, unfortunately, there's not much information in there. In some other work that we are doing right now, we are actually using BGT, so burning glass technology data, where we're relying on online vacancy information. And we are using the skill information based on that. And we've done a number of papers now where we look particularly actually at the skills that are needed in order to work with artificial intelligence. And you might imagine that, these are very, very technical jobs where maybe these kind of skills are less relevant, but it's actually not the case. So, teamwork skills, presentation skills, written and verbal communication skills are very, very important, even for those very technical jobs. So yes, that's definitely a big drawback there. And now to address a couple of the points of the discussion. First of all, thank you very much. Everything well taken on board for sure. So I think one of the major issues with this work is we are really not trying to claim causality here. We also agree, I think, I can speak on behalf of my co-authors here, that the instruments we've used there are not ideal, but unfortunately, we are given only so much in the PIAC survey that we can work with. And so we've tried to basically make the best out of that, given the information that was available. But as I was saying earlier, this is really just kind of another sensitivity check that we try to impose there in order to, just see whether our story holds or not. I think in terms of the policy implications, it's a bit tricky also. I mean, just to go back to this one point you made about email use at home, this was just something we were thinking about. So, just to give you a bit of background information. So we're working with PIAC here, where the first wave was actually collected in 2011. Then we have another wave, I think 2014 and 17. So it's relatively old data, if you want to think. So, even some of these ICT related tasks which seem to be quite basic back then, and then, given the wide area of jobs, it's non-trivial. So, but I take on your point for sure. Well, yeah, now going back to the policy implications, based on the analysis that we have done, we can't really say, whether an early intervention would help there. I think some of the other papers we've done, we've definitely seen this. And then on top of that, also given that we are dealing here with the working age population, and we are mainly focusing on task-based skills. So these are skills related to on the job. The main focus would be probably more on up or reskilling rather than on earlier interventions with regards to this study here. But in general, other findings that we have from other papers suggest that, early intervention is the way to go here. And I've just seen my co-author, Emil, has also joined. So I don't know whether you want to add anything.
Go ahead if there's anything quickly. I think we can't see your co-author.
Okay.
I think that's just about it. Any other quick
okay.
questions from the floor? Okay, Leah, you've summed up. Great, thank you, very good, thank you all. Let's move straight on to paper 2. So thank you, Leah. So the next paper is Cecilia Lasinio from Lewis and ISTAT on organizational capital and global value chain participation. And I look to the technicians it has been brought up already. Excellent. Cecilia, so 15 minutes, please. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, and hello everybody. Let me just say that I'm really sorry for not being able to be there with all of you. And thank you for having us presenting this paper. So this is a joint effort. Sorry, I cannot see the presentation. So there are issues. Oh, okay, great. Okay, so this paper is a joint effort together with Valentina Meliciani and Silvia Sopranzetti from the Ministry of Economic and Finance. This paper is actually an attempt to take a very close look at the relationship between the effect that the participation to global value chain might generate on productivity growth, taking into account the role of organizational capital. So in other words, the idea is to check if organizational capital assumed to be a proxy of managerial capabilities might play a relevant role in explaining this relationship. The main motivation for looking at this relationship is because there has been a widespread of empirical and theoretical literature looking at the different relationship between either the impact of participation on productivity or of course, all the literature on intangibles and mainly organizational capital on productivity growth. But however, all this literature actually does not provide a straightforward message. So either the theoretical as well as the empirical evidence is rather mixed. One of the reasons why this literature provides, especially the empirical one, mixed evidence is that there are actually very relevant heterogeneities across countries that have to be considered once we explore the conditions under which the participation to global value chain actually affect productivity growth. And very likely, some of those can be referred to sectoral characteristics, like, for example, the extent of the digital transformation. So in this paper, what we aim to test, and we argue that it is likely that the gains from participation might be highly asymmetric between countries and sectors, and that these asymmetries in some sense might be dependent on the extent of investment in organizational capital, as well as on sectoral digitalization. So as I was mentioning, also in terms of the theoretical literature, there has been many papers starting also, from the papers mostly looking at the relationship between productivity gains and offshoring, and you see in the slide some of them mentioned. Anyway, what we really focus on more closely are the empirical papers, like for example, the one by Chris Quall and Timmis, proposing some of the main mechanisms through which there can be gains from the participation to global value chain in terms of productivity, and also testing on a sample of OECD countries. But anyway, what is evident is that, as I was saying before, the evidence is rather mixed. So in terms of what we actually aim to do in this paper, it is really to try to take at the same time into account the different and multiple factors that might affect this relationship. So on one side, we of course refer to different streams of the literature, such as all those literature looking at the productivity impact of organizational capital and managerial capabilities on productivity growth. So like, for example, all the papers by Bloom, Van Reenen and co-authors. Then, of course, there is another stream of literature looking at the relationship between managerial capabilities and participation to a global value chain. And then we also steal, some of the ideas from those literature looking at the complementarities between organizational capital and information technology. So the main idea is that, of course, this is likely a complex relationship, but what we aim to do in this paper is to propose a framework, a very simple one, where we try to test if there are complementarities between organizational capital and participation to global value chain, and if this complementarities is stronger in the digital intensive sectors, and if so, if this might be of help for explaining some productivity differentials across countries. So again, the empirical analysis that we develop in this paper is developed adopting an augmented production function framework, where essentially we augment the standard production function by means of a measure of global value chain participation and then interaction between organizational capital and measure of backward participation. The data that we use in our sorry, in our paper are essentially the database is created by merging UCLAMS, WIOD, and Intangible for 11 European economies and plus the US over the period 1998-2015. As for the analysis of the impact of the relationship between productivity, global value chain, and organizational capital in the digital intensive sectors, we refer to the taxonomy proposed by the OECD, which is listed, proposed in a paper by Berlingeri and others in 2018. And here in these slides is just, the list of the sectors that we use in our analysis. Anyway, so let me, sorry, there is a delay in when I, okay, let us now, take a look at what the data actually suggest. So in this chart, we represent a simple correlation between the measure, the indicator of backward participation and labor productivity growth, together with the circles that actually represents the intensity of of investment in organizational capital in the different countries. And then we have the three different charts for the different categories of industries classified as the OECD classification between high, medium, and low digital intensive. So as we can see, and this is what I just want you to notice, is that, of course, the correlation between productivity growth and backward participation, as already found in previous papers, is rather positive and statistically significant for the high digital intensive sectors, where anyway we can see that there is a rather high level of heterogeneity of intensity for organizational capital across countries. This correlation actually diminishes and becomes less statistically significant for the medium digital intensive sectors, and essentially vanishes for the low digital intensive. So the purpose of our empirical analysis is actually to test in a more structured framework this relationship. And essentially here you can see the model that we test. It is, as I was saying at the very beginning, a very simple model of a production function where we essentially test the impact of the global value chain participation and the complementary effect between organizational capital and global value chain participation on labor productivity growth. In this specification, we control for the different type of capitals, either tangible and intangible. We distinguish also between ICT and non-ICT. And of course, we are aware that in this type of estimates that might be significant endogeneity issues, so the biases can be significant. And this is why we test this model also for together with instrumental variable and GMM. And we also have some specific instruments for global value chain participation. But of course, in the paper, there are all the details. So what are our results? So first of all, in this table, you can see the first set of results, which are referred, we do not report, of course, all the controls. The first three columns refer to the complete sample, where essentially the first two columns are generalized square, and the third one is instead instrumental, refers to the instrumental variable results. Now, As you can see, the interaction between the intensity of organizational capital and the backward participation is positive and significant, and remains significant and positive also when we test with the model with the instrumental variable. Same results are of course obtained with the GMM. In the other three columns, we run the same exercise, but simply testing the intangibles excluding R&D, just to check if there are additional effects going on there. And as you can see, the significance remains actually there. Then we test further our specification to see if there are some sectoral specificities that can actually affect these results. Now I'm showing mostly, the GLS results, but of course there are GMM and IV results available for all the estimates that I'm showing. So as you can see in this table, we in the first two columns we test for this model for the total services only. And what we found is that actually there are no complementarities. So the significance of the complementarity, the coefficient for the complementarity between organizational capital and participation to global value chain actually is not there. So this relationship doesn't show up as significant when we look at only at total services. If we then adopt a different sectoral disaggregation and we look more specifically into the high and the low digital, it is immediately, as you can see, evident that for the high digital intensive sectors, the complementarity is there. The coefficient is significant and robustly estimated. As I said, in the IV also confirm the same results. And in the last two columns, we just test for eventual lagged effects in this complementarity effect. And the idea is that also in this respect, these are there. Now, just to conclude, our findings essentially show that the productivity impact of global value chain participation actually seems to be correlated, and so depends in some sense on investment in organizational capital. And this is especially so for the high digital intensive sectors. There are likely strong asymmetries in managerial capabilities across countries and sectors that can eventually may lead to very asymmetric productivity gains from global value chain participation. And this was this result was already highlighted by Duran and Milger in 2018. Further, our results seem to suggest that, of course, we need to continue to investigate this relationship because there are likely multiple factors affecting these results. But anyway, what is clear is that a larger marginal effect from backward participation on productivity growth is there for those countries and industries that actually have higher intensity of organizational capital. As I said, this result is stronger in the high digital sectors. So at the end, what we can assume is that it is likely that the managerial capabilities are an essential element to extract value from participation in global value chain, and this is particularly so in the high digital intensive sector. What we think it would be, of course, very important to do in the near future is, and to continue, along this line, is to also include, for example, the role of training and having the possibility of better controlling also for other type of skills in this relationship. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. The discussant is Monique Abel from BAYES, but none of us can currently remember what BAYES actually stands for. So
Oh, I could remind you. It is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. No, and no skills anymore either. That's all DFE. Could I have my slide? Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And I should definitely say that make my disclaimer that I'm here in a personal capacity. These are my views and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer or wider government. Next slide, please. So I am, however, going to approach this discussion with very much with my day job in mind, in terms of focusing a bit more on the question and the answer and how to interpret it, sort of using as a sort of a as a restriction, does it use appropriate data and methodology? Next slide, please. So I do think the paper asks a compelling question, and one that is potentially quite relevant for policy. So does greater organizational capital enhance productivity growth from participation in backward GBCs? Definitely an interesting question. And does R&D intensity matter for the answer? Why is it interesting for policy or potentially relevant? We have scarce resources, right? As anyone does. So it's anything that, results that can help us prioritize and focus policy on the sectors most likely to benefit is likely to be quite helpful and interesting to us. Next question, please. There we go. Appropriate data. Yes, I have a couple of minor comments on perhaps explaining a little more explicitly in the paper some of the measures of organizational capital. Appropriate methods, yes, diff and diff, lovely. I guess the one thing I did want to comment on was, of course, when you're doing diff and diff with an interaction, that's, as the authors rightly note, you're agnostic on causality within the interaction. So the paper can't really, or the method can't really speak to the question of, is it greater organizational capital that leads to increased productivity gains from value chain participation, or is it the reverse? Is it that greater participation in GBCs increases the gains from organizational capital? That sounds a bit academic, but actually it's not, because the policies that we would use to encourage greater backward GBC participation in sectors with high organizational capital are quite different from the ones we would do in the opposite case. So I think it is an interesting paper, and it's very much an appropriate method, but with some limitations for how we can interpret the results. Next, please. So what answer does the paper offer? Yes, the paper offers the answer that indeed there is a positive coefficient on the key interaction term, and yes, there is an interaction between organizational capital and value chain participation. So those two things are complements. This seems to be robust to dealing with endogeneity in a couple of different ways. The thing about interpreting this, though, and the thing that I slightly struggled with, was that it seems that most of the sample, so there are a total of 126 country sector pairs, and I think 107 of them are in services sectors. So given the number of countries, that leaves maybe one or two. So manufacturing must be kind of all one big sector. And I believe that was confirmed, I think, earlier in the presentation. So I guess if we can move on to the next slide. So that leaves, I guess, the key interaction coefficient is positive and significant then for the total sample, but for services only, it wasn't. And so I was trying to disentangle a bit what does this mean for manufacturing sectors? So the results would seem to apply for a broad manufacturing sector compared to a number of services sectors, but then we can't really say anything about whether they apply within manufacturing across manufacturing subsectors. And so that is, you know, I'm sure just a limitation of the data that the authors had at their disposal, and you know, that's fine. That's no, but I think it means that we can really interpret this as a services result, and it's a little more challenging or services and for R&D intensive industries result, but it's a little more challenging to say anything about manufacturing. And I think I'll leave it there. But very nice paper, and I really enjoyed having the chance to comment on it.
Questions. We're getting a little short of time, but there's time for one or two questions. While you pause and think, Cecilia, do you want to comment? Do you want to react at all? But again, sort of 2 minutes rather than longer, I'm afraid, reacting to the discussants' comments.
Okay, so thank you, and thank you for all your comments. Okay, let me just reply to a couple of them. First of all, how to treat, you know, the interaction term. I think that this is a critical point. The assumption there is that the interaction variable actually is symmetric with respect to the interactive terms. So we do not say anything at this stage about the causality, at this stage at least. So we simply assume that organizational capital is our conditional variable affecting the effect of backward participation on productivity, but we do not actually at this stage having done any type of assumptions in terms of or interpretation in terms of causality. Of course, the idea is that also looking, you know, at the literature, looking at the relationship between, so the role of organizational capital on global value chain participation, that of course, this might be the direction of the causality. But as I said, at this stage, this is really a first test. Second point, and I will be very quick, in terms of your observation for services versus manufacturing, that's totally true. The limitation of the data depends mostly on the fact that we do not have the possibility of disaggregating, for example, the manufacturing sector, especially for the data on intangibles. The good news, so we are perfectly aware about that. The good news is that, you know, in the forthcoming UCLAMS Intan-Invest version that will be published before the end of the year, we will have all the intangibles disaggregating also for the manufacturing sector. So we could actually test also, you know, specific results for the manufacturing sector. So thank you very much, and very nice to have participated, and bye everybody.
Thank you. Very good. No last questions. Good. Thank you, Cecilia. Okay, let's move straight on. Dennis Fixler from the BEA with the title, The Reliability of the Contribution of Intellectual Property Products to GDP Growth. Let me just say, we have to be out of this room at past. They're setting up dinner in this very room, or they will be, whether we're in it or not. So, Dennis, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I will be cognizant of time. My co-author, Ava DeFrancisco, is on the screen as well. So like all statistical agencies, interested in providing accurate information about the economy as much as possible. So we have regular revisions to estimates, and you can view those as going two ways. The flow of source data, improving the flow of source data, and methodological updates for defining the measures. So in 2013, as part of our comprehensive update, we took the investment category, created this in intellectual property products, and then gave it 3 components. And so the idea here was to see, since all the attention was directed to intellectual property products, what would be, these would be the 3 categories that we thought would be, let's say, easier to measure at the outset. And the last bullet, you could see that they have grown as a share of GDP since 2013. Now, the paper that I'm going to present is in the spirit of Corrado, Holton and Sickle and Corrado et al. We're looking at how important are these components, the trends in these components telling a story about relationships to productivity. Most analysis, when it looks at productivity, they treat in an aggregate sense IPP as a single category. So what we thought we would look here is there a different story for different components, at least in the BEA data? So we consider 7 sectors and look at the trends in IPP investment, its components, and the attending capital stock, and how they relate to productivity, labor productivity, and multi-factor productivity. The data are all from BEA, except the multi-factor productivity estimates are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So just to get a feel of things, let's look at the nominal quarterly growth rates by vintage. So I started off by saying there's a flow of source data. So one of the natural questions is, as we get more source data, are we revising the story about what's going on with investment in IPP? Fortunately, that's not the case, as you can see in this diagram, that there's high correlation between the trends between the different vintage estimates. So the things that we're going to talk about are going to be with the latest estimates, the last vintage, and not worry about different stories for different vintages. Another important distinction here is that between government IPP and private IPP. Government in the United States is a major funder of investment in intellectual property products, R&D expenditures, and software in particular. And so here's a look at how the growth rates compare, and it's dominated by private. And so keep that in mind here when we're looking at the trends. So looking at the components of IPP, nominal and real. So the left-hand side here are the nominal growth rates in each one of these components. You can see that R&D is far more volatile than software. And just to give you an idea, for the nominal rates, the R&D growth rate is 6%. The average annual growth rate at 6.8% for software and 3% for entertainment, literary, and artistic originals. On the right-hand side is the real components. 4.7% for R&D is the average annual growth rate, 7.3% for software, and 2.8% for entertainment, literary, and artistic originals. So recall, I said 6.8% for software and nominal, 7.3% for software in real. So this gets at this whole idea about coming up with these price measures for intellectual property products is an important endeavor, and we are spending a lot of effort in improving these as best we can, because the accounting for quality change, as in the case of software, is clearly an important component here. So what we wanted to look at was the heterogeneity of investment patterns in IPP by industry. So we picked the 7 sectors I'm going to show you. And the way to do this is the magnitudes are huge. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you, we're going to construct indexes here, but there's a timing issue here, largely because of 2 industrial classifications in play here. So In 1998, the United States, Canada, and Mexico adopted the North American Industrial Classification System. Prior to that was the Standard Industrial Classification System. So not all the historical data and all the sectors has been converted to the old system. So that's why we have two starting points, if you will, 1998 for gross output and labor productivity, and for the capital series, we have 1980. So here are the sectors, here are the industries that we look at, and it's a gross output, millions of dollars in increasing order. So you could see that non-durables and information are extremely important in terms of the sectors, but perhaps more informative is this chart, this table, that shows you the industries in the sectors that we are looking at. And then it gives you nominal output per worker, again, using 1998 data, and everything is normalized to 1 for all industries. And again, now we have increasing order of output per worker in the sector. So you could see here that the information sector is the highest one, but then the next one is durable goods and non-durable goods, which are going to be the components of the manufacturing sector that I'm going to look at. So one way to look at how things are evolving is to, let's take the investment share of IPP in 1980. So this is the share of IPP investment in 1980 over total investment. And then in the far column, I have the same share in 2020. And here is the sectors that we're looking at. So it's the first one is in 1980 is professional and technical industry. And you can see that in 2020, it drops. Management is higher. Information, the share is 0.24 in 1980. It's 0.41 in 2020. But I'm going to focus on durables. So look at what happens with durables. In durables, it's 0.35 in 1980. It's 0.64 in 2020. Non-durables, 0.22 in 1980, 0.61 in 2020. So huge growth in investment in IPP in these two industries. And what's also interesting is looking at the two middle columns, showing you how that growth is broken up between software and R&D. And you can see there's a considerable difference in many of the industries, and in particular the two I just mentioned, non-durables and durables. You could see that it's heavily in R&D. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the manufacturing sector. We're going to treat it generally in terms of durables and non-durables. And the following tables I'm going to show you are based on the idea here that the numerical values are so large that we're going to, the tables are based on constructing indexes. So 1980 is taken as the base year so that you can see trends a lot easier. And then we're going to take the differences in those index values as the growth rates. So to be more specific here, let's look at durables. So the top panel shows the investment shares, and then related to other aspects of investment. So you could see in 1980, IPP was 35% of the investment share. Most of the investment was equipment. ST stands for structures. Okay, and you can see the trend in the investment shares. 1980, notice, is indexed as 1. So more than a third of the total investment expenses was going to IPP. The lower panel shows the investment shares in IPP for durables, but then it's in terms of the three components. And you can see here that the software one is really strong. R&D is relatively stable. Software outgrew investment, until the end of the 90s. So it's heavily investing in software, R&D stable. But the premise of this exercise, this descriptive exercise, is what can we say about productivity here? So the top graph is the time series for the index changes in multi-factor productivity, and the pink shaded areas are the recessions. And in the bottom diagram, the dashed lines are the capital stock, and the solid lines are the level of investment in the components. And so you could see that the correlation is different. It's higher than the correlation between the changes in MFP and real capital and software. You could see that increasing MFP falls with, it falls in the recessions, rises and then falls. Same was true for R&D investment, except during the Great Recession. And the Great Recession, the stock of the components of IPP capital and the attending investment moved in different directions. So these are interesting, and the point of view is each one of these components are moving differently, and therefore it's telling different stories if you want to look at investment patterns. So looking at non-durable goods, same methodology of presentation here. So 1980, we see that the share is 1. So equipment was 61%, IPP was 22%, but you can see that the share of equipment is falling and things are changing in terms of the investment patterns. Its importance relative investment in structures grew continuously, the investment in IPP. If I look at the lower panel, it's similar to the story in durables. Again, you see that R&D was the dominating, stable, not 0.94%, but not changing that. So even though there's an increase in the share of IPP for software until the end of the 90s. So you have very different activities that are going on with respect to these three components. And if I go and want to see what they look like with respect to productivity, I have this graph. And again, you can see that the changes in multi-factor productivity for non-durables is a lot more volatile than it was for durable. The patterns of the code movements when R&D and software are much harder to see here. And R&D is weakly positively correlated with MFP. Software investment negatively correlated for this sector. MFP is only weakly correlated to labor productivity. So it's different than what we found in the durable sector. So again, the idea here was that not to treat IPP as a single aggregate when looking at TFP measures, the importance of decomposing it and seeing what matters in terms of investment. Now, I picked manufacturing because that's one of the most important sectors that everybody looks at. This is the durable goods sector contains, computer manufacturing, motor vehicle manufacturing. The non-durable sector contains chemicals. So these are, which in turn contains pharmaceuticals. So these are the dynamic, innovative sectors. But we did look at some other sectors and qualitatively found the same kinds of things. The interesting thing is, you see, I didn't really mention artistic originals, but they are important in consumer services and information. Not surprising, consumer services is movies, information contains publishing and so on. So it's not surprising. So next bullet, consumer services, arts and entertainment, it was 66% in 1980. So the entertainment, literary, and artistic originals didn't play much of a role in the MFP trend. R&D and software investment and capital trends were idiosyncratic. Some sectors were more volatile than others, and the relationship to the trends in MFP were also idiosyncratic. So what are the implications? So if you're going to tell a story about the importance of IPP, both to the economy and to industries, it's very important to look at the components. And I think that previous papers here sort of got at the same story. I need to decompose into the components. The sector differences in the trends, different relationships with sector trends in MFP. Labor productivity can be approximated by, using the Solow growth equation and taking the difference between output growth and capital growth. And we're going to focus more on labor productivity in future research. And we're going to look into the industry detail further to shed light on the relationship between this productivity and IPP at the sector level. So go down more detailed in the industries. So it's a very basic descriptive analysis, more or less outlining an investment program, and we certainly would welcome comments and suggestions for future work. So I think I met my time deadline. So
you are indeed. Great. So thank you, Dennis, for being more or less exactly on time. Joe Grice is the discussant. See, now there's some steps. Never mind. Good for my exercise. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and thank you very much to Dennis and his colleagues for the paper, which I thought was very thorough and very systematic, very workmanlike. I guess it's motivated by two key points. One, showing that the sectoral behavior of IPP, in the US at least, varies very significantly across the sectors. So with a warning implicitly that looking at too aggregate a picture may well be misleading. And second motivation to look, at least in a preliminary way, at the relationship with IPP and sectoral multi-factor productivity. Now, the paper certainly succeeds in the first of those. It's very clear from the data that we're given that both the level and the growth in IPP varies enormously by sector, as you perhaps might expect, but also the changes over time in the composition of IPP between research and development, software, and artistic originals, which are the three components broken down in the paper. It's very clear to me, at least on that basis of that the warning against thinking about this in an excessively aggregate way is likely to be well taken. In terms of the second motivation, I think the outcome is a little bit more negative. There's actually a very striking point in the conclusion of the paper. In the 7 sectors that we examine, it's generally true that trends in multi-factor productivity are not dependent on trends in IPP, capital, stock, or investment. Now, it has to be said that that quite stark conclusion is qualified by the fact that the paper draws attention to possible mismeasurement issues. And I think it's also fair to say that the analysis is probably fairly preliminary, mainly relying on correlation analysis across the various sectors. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. Some comments on the paper. It rightly points out that there is an important difference between nominal IPP and real IPP. Are we talking about the nominal values or are we talking about the volume? But we're not told very much about the deflation process, and clearly deflation becomes critically important if you want to make that distinction between real and nominal growth. And as we know, there's a whole raft of issues about what is the appropriate deflator for IPP products. Leonard Nakamura was saying this morning he has a strong suspicion that actually the real deflator for IPP has been declining very sharply, and I must say personally I find that quite plausible. But in that case, if there is a significant fall in prices which we've not taken into account, it may well be that the actual real, the estimated real value of IPP is different from what the figures currently show. So I think more attention to the deflator is certainly one of the things I would suggest for further work in response to Dennis's invitation. Secondly, the paper notes that there's a lot of microdata available nowadays, but it then says, without any real explanation, that sectoral analysis is probably the right focus of approach. I'm slightly inclined to question that, just as we can see that the various sectors behave in a very different way. It seems to me that some of the industries and concerns within the sectors also actually behave in quite disparate ways. So I would suspect that further attention to the microdata, even below the sectoral level we've seen so far, might well reveal some insights. But then I just want to come back to my last and slightly more general comment, which really comes a bit out of this conclusion that we haven't really found this relationship between IPP and multi-factor productivity. All statistics, certainly official ones, perhaps all statistics, are useful only to the extent that they actually help us explain or predict the world. We shouldn't be producing stuff and concentrating on stuff just because it's interesting or because we can. And I tend to think in terms of some of the wider measures of IPP that we're sometimes urged to think about may come into that category. So it seems to me the priority is actually for this agenda is actually to bolt down why is this information useful to us? And in the context of productivity, the concern of this session, it seems to me that the challenge is then clear. Can we actually do better than the results so far in terms of pinning down that relationship, if there is one, between growth in IPP and productivity performance? There are some papers, of course, which purport to do that, but you sort of get the feel that it's really a bit kind of now you see it, now you don't. And that robust relationship, I think, is still to be revealed, that robust explanation. So that would be my final contribution in response to Dennis's invitation to give suggestions for further work. And it might indeed, Tony, be an issue, a big issue, I'm sure it is already, for your Productivity Institute. Thank you.
Yeah, any further questions or points? Yeah, Jonathan. There's a microphone right at you.
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Hello, Dennis. I can't see you, but I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Enjoyed the paper very much, Dennis. On the issue of the connection between R&D or IPP more generally in industry I and TFP in industry I, of course there were spillovers, as you well know, going on. So there may be no relationship whatsoever. It might be that there were tons of spillovers going on. But then where that takes you is to an observation, I think you referred to it earlier on, that Janice Eberly has made, which is that R&D is increasingly concentrated, as I understand it, not only in the manufacturing sector, which you're focusing on, but just in pharmaceuticals in the manufacturing sector, which then takes one to being supportive of what you're doing, which is one ought to separate out the IPP components, because as Dan and Carol and Chuck have told us, there's much more to innovation expenditure than just R&D. So I'm sort of supportive of all of that. One final thing, if I may, Tony, which is that on the arts and entertainment side, that strikes me as being just very interesting in and of itself, not least because, of course, investment in artistic originals and so forth has now got a very large software component to it. So unraveling the measurement issues about whether we're able to make better movies with more software, is that a consequence of software investment, or is that underneath the artistic original investment and so forth? So I think just that industry in and of itself is worthy of further study. Thanks very much.
Any further questions? Dennis, over to you for briefish.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the comments, and thank you, Joe, for your insightful discussion. I agree with what you say. We have spent at BEA a lot of time trying to improve the deflators for intellectual property products, improving the deflators for ICT, which of course are in some sense related. So absolutely, looking at the price index is extremely important here to tell a story where the volume measure is informative. And to your point about microdata and breaking down the sectors, if you look at the, I think it's table 2 in the paper, if you look at that and you see that we decompose the healthcare sector into 3 major categories. We didn't talk about it in detail in the paper, but there are extremely different stories about IPP investment in just those 3 industries within the healthcare sector. So as I said, this initial descriptive analysis really identified the kinds of things that it's hard to tell a single unified story here about the role of IPP, which goes to Jonathan's point. Even though artistic originals in general are not seen important, for some industries it's hugely important. And he raised a very interesting question there. How do you disentangle some of the software investment that goes on these days to the entertainment and literary and artistic originals? So I think I've got Ava and I, who's listening in, we've gotten some great suggestions on the next version of the paper, and I thank you for your comments.
Great, thank you, Dennis. And thanks to all the participants, speakers, discussants, and everyone else for a fascinating session.